So one of the things that I have been profoundly committed to as it relates to the whole world of entrepreneurship is this concept of helping entrepreneurs get access to capital. And where I like to always start is educating our entrepreneur as to what funding sources are even available and helping them distinguish where the pitfalls are. And we titled this legitimate funding sources because there are lots of funding sources that are out there, and when I use the word legitimate, I guess it would imply that there are some illegitimate funding sources out there. And probably a better title would be um, funding sources that are really truly designed for win-win-win. There are a lot of what I would consider to be predatory funders out there, and there's a particular way that I would categorize a predatory. Usually, it's lenders, predatory lender, or even predatory investor. And I'll take a few moments in this conversation to identify some of those types of funding sources that I would put in the predatory place. Not all, say, high interest loans or investors that want a large chunk of equity. I wouldn't say that that is the only variable for defining somebody as a predatory lender or an investor. So when we get into that section, I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean by that and how you can avoid the unfortunate mass confusion that I think is somewhat intentional. I think there's not enough transparency in what people are really signing up for. And so what happens is entrepreneurs often get trapped in a really bad deal that they didn't know. So this is really here to help entrepreneurs navigate this process with a bit more education, with their eyes a bit more wide open. Again, the intention here is really to define what those funding options are for entrepreneurs and investors. This is not going to talk about consumer-based funding whatsoever. Get a better understanding what options make the most sense and what to watch out for. I always have to put in a disclaimer. And let me start here by talking about, let's start by talking about the first steps, if you will. So anytime an entrepreneur is trying to raise capital, there's a system that I recommend every entrepreneur go through. First, I encourage every entrepreneur to work with financial and legal experts. Choosing the right funding source or funding partner can be tricky, and not understanding what the language is in the contracts, in the deals, what you're actually buying as an entrepreneur can be fatal. And so working with the right types of accounting, tax, and legal professionals, I think, is the smartest place to start. Then entrepreneurs really need to focus on choosing the funding type that they want. And I'll go through some examples of the different types of funding. It's not intended to be all-inclusive, but it'll give a pretty good broad range of the different types of funding. Venture capital or VC, angel investors, crowdfunding, those are common terms that are heard. And that's what I mean when I talk about the types of funding, like where are people getting their money. Third, defining the amount that needs to be raised. No entrepreneur should ever raise capital without having a clearly defined amount. Broad ranges is a sure signal to any funder that this person does not know what they're doing with the money. So never, ever, ever present a request for funding without having a clearly defined amount. And then choosing the actual method of funding, debt versus equity or other methods, is also critical to the initial stages and steps of and even before you even start the process of raising capital, then defining the use of funds and the financial projections which correlate to those funding methods will set the stage and help the entrepreneur be prepared for the due diligence process, and defining any investment terms, rewards, etc. as applicable. And again, this is all very much defined by the funding method that was chosen and the funding type. And then lastly, I'm big on matrices, and I'll give you an example of what a matrix could look like, of putting out the funding options based on the funding type that was chosen and the funding method. I really like this statistic, and I don't know who to credit this to, but basically, if we as entrepreneurs do the first 15% of anything right, if we do anything, focus on doing the first 15% right, because that first 15% gives you an 85% chance of success. So starting off right, having a clear strategy, having a clear plan, having everything laid out will make the actual capital fundraise process go much, much faster and easier. So when we talk about this first area, the number 2, choosing the funding type, there are several funding sources, and this is just an infographic that was about a year old at this point, from 2014, I believe, that shows where the top funding sources are. I mean, we're talking about a $531 billion per year transaction of money moving around. And so if that's the size, then clearly there's a need out there for entrepreneurs to access capital. So where are entrepreneurs getting their funding? Well, the overwhelming majority is personal savings and credit. Then you're looking at friends and family. Then you're looking at, surprisingly, venture capital. Now, what's interesting is this particular space is shrinking fast, and it's being replaced by alternative funding sources out there, most notably and especially the crowdfunding space, which you see last on the screen. Angel investors and banks also feeling the impact of a lot of alternative funding sources coming out there, but still leading the pack in terms of the type of funding sources. This is another way to look at different funding sources. You can see that at the bottom we're looking at our own savings, investments, credit cards. Then we look at potentially self-directed retirement plans. A lot of people had traditional jobs and got created their own 401ks. It is possible and highly legitimate to use your own or other people's 401ks and retirement plans if they are transferred to a proper custodian fiduciary, so that retirement plan is now called self-directed. So self-directed retirement plans is a great source of capital. There are a lot of rules around how to do that properly, and yet it's not complicated. And it's a very affordable and very quick access to capital for entrepreneurs. Then you go into what I would consider to be a business model or revenue model design. So it's like, how do you structure your business so that you can access capital by creating opportunities, maybe through your employees or partners, by designing and developing a business model that creates capital through the business model itself. Could be through franchising, licensing opportunities, etc. Then you get into more outside capital sources. So everything up until there is mostly internal. Then you get into partnerships, and then you really are talking about, when people think about raising capital, they start really thinking about private investors or lenders. Private investors or lenders are people that are in your network, people you know, or people that you know. These are not necessarily sophisticated professional investors. These are people who maybe have a couple $100,000 sitting in a 1 to 2% money market, or very low interest bearing or low return investment, and they're looking for something to do with this capital. And if you're a trusted, proven entrepreneur that's got great character, great integrity, it is highly possible to raise private money through your own network. and is actually probably the most common way to do it, that go beyond friends and family. But most people start with friends and family. And then you've heard of this term crowdfunding, and I'll get into crowdfunding just a little bit. Not a lot. This is not intended to be a crowdfunding webinar, but enough to understand just in general, what is this thing called crowdfunding? Why is it important? And should entrepreneurs even be paying attention to it? Then you get into alternative funding sources. Most commonly, you see things like CDFIs and factoring. Again, I'll define CDFI a little bit later. It's an alternative funding source that exists out there. And then you get into traditional banking, angel investors who are professional investors that are accredited investors that have amassed, generally a few $1 million of assets, and they want to put those assets into use and generate a return. And angel investors typically differentiate themselves from VCs because they like to be more engaged, be more involved in mentoring entrepreneurs and having a more hands-on involvement with the business and its opportunity to succeed and grow. VCs are very, very professional investors or institutional investors. And these are folks looking for very specific outcomes, and generally those outcomes are 10 times multiple on their initial capital investment or higher. And VCs are often considered to be sharks, but you got to really put things in perspective as to when somebody would use a VC and why. And VCs don't make sense for a lot of businesses. But they do make sense in some instances, and understanding who should be looking at VCs and who shouldn't is important. And then at the top, we talk about EB-5 funding, which is a government program, and grants. Again, this is not all-inclusive, but this is pretty comprehensive, as you can tell. This is kind of shaped, is in line with a sort of a pyramid, because the access or the ease of getting the capital at the top, at the very point of this pyramid, is very difficult. The percentage of people that apply and are awarded at the top is very low compared to the bottom of this chart. So one of the things that I think entrepreneurs really need to understand is that, the most important asset to an entrepreneur isn't actually money, it's time. And so knowing what the options are, and I've worked with entrepreneurs for a long time, and I see a lot of people waste their time and energy going after the wrong type of funding at the wrong time in their business in not being prepared. And they just, rather than spend that time wasting their time running around going after money that's just, the probability of getting access to that capital is so low that it's really not worth the time and energy. They could be spending that time and energy proving the concept of their business, growing their business, generating revenue. And so I see so many people not understand this framework by itself and get lost in the process. And knowing where to target the effort will generate a much higher return on that entrepreneur's time. The other big thing that I really want to point out is what I have there in the box, and it's a statement that I say all the time, and that is, there is no such thing as a money problem. Most entrepreneurs that raise capital do so for the absolutely wrong reasons. The best solution to what people think is a money problem is an idea. There are no money problems, only idea problems. You cannot use money to solve a money problem. All you do is create a bigger problem, because the thinking that got into the money problem to begin with is the same thinking that's using money to try to solve the problem. It will not get solved. So I spend a lot of time working with entrepreneurs to find creative solutions to what they think are money problems, where really it could be a business model issue, a revenue model issue, a lack of focus and clarity or strategy. There could be a lot of different things at work that could solve what seems to be a money problem. So though this conversation is focused on giving clarity to finding better sources of capital and funding, the first thing everyone should always start with is even asking themselves, do I really need this money? And because it's a process, it's an investment of time, it's an investment of energy, and it will take an entrepreneur away from their business for several months. So remember, there are no money problems, only idea problems. So if you go back to that sheet, let me go back a few steps. I said, first you got to find your funding type. So I gave a demonstration of the different types of funding, and I'll get into a few more of them in a little bit. You want to define the amount to raise. This webinar is not designed to support entrepreneurs in getting that defined, but that's why you work with professional accountants to really help look at the financial model to get clear on what the amount is that we want to raise. And then we're getting into this next piece, which is choosing the funding method. So let's look at that. So this, again, is not intended to be complete, but it is a good broad overview of the different types of funding methods. It's also a good example of a matrix. So when somebody says, okay, let's just say they are interested in raising money through alternative funding sources. They're looking at maybe CDFI, micro-lending, private equity, different alternative funding sources. They feel that they're not quite ready for traditional funding yet, so this is the way they want to go. So then when they look at the funding methods, they want to look at, well, if I'm going to go alternative funding, I have a lot of choices in how that funding method is actually defined. And, a lot of entrepreneurs don't understand that we have a lot of freedom in designing the terms of our funding. If you go to more traditional funding sources at the top, you have very little control over the terms. You have some say, but not a lot. But when you get down underneath the banking level and you want to talk about creating terms that work for everyone, and I love win-win-win scenarios. So you want to create something that's a win for the company, that's a win for the investor funding source, and a win for the beneficiaries of that business, who would be the customers and the employees and the talent. So looking at these funding methods, you've got debt, equity, royalty. I consider this whole topic business model. I should really just call it probably asset lending, and then donations and grants. Now, I will point out a couple things, a couple misinformation that's out there. First of all, not all debt requires interest. And I'll give you an example of at least one source that does not charge interest. And not all for-profit entities, not all donation and grants are issued exclusively to tax-exempt charitable organizations. You can actually be a for-profit enterprise and receive donations and grants. And so we'll talk about what that is. Now, because it's pretty clearly laid out here, I'm not going to walk through every single box. I'll point out a couple things. Obviously when you're considering, and when an entrepreneur considers what type of method they want, these are some of the considerations. Does it have to be repaid? Is there any ownership that's shared? At what stage does this type of funding method make sense for the business? Because, when you're at the very beginning, you're just in this initial concept stage, donations, grants, that's perfect. In some cases, equity, depending on the type of business, and business modeling factoring, again, based on the type of business. But then there are others that are really best suited for getting to that next stage, which is what I would call the proof of concept stage. That's when you already are past the idea, you've already started generating some revenue, and the entrepreneur is really just proving the model. Does this work? Is there really a demand in the marketplace for this service or product? And in this stage, there's just a lot of learning going on, a lot of trial and error. And not a lot of outside funding sources like to fund companies that are in the proof of concept stage, but some do. Proof of concept stage is the better place, from my opinion, on where to start with debt funding, not because necessarily other people wouldn't loan at the startup stage or the initial concept stage, but because as an entrepreneur, You need to go to sleep at night and be able to sleep well, knowing that you can pay back this loan. And having been as an entrepreneur now for going on 17 years, 16 years, I have lost a lot of sleep over my concern for whether or not I'm going to be able to honor my financial agreements. I don't do that anymore. The stress of being the challenge of being an entrepreneur is stressful enough. To add on top of that, a need to have to repay a loan when you haven't even proven to yourself yet that the concept is proven is just not something I would encourage any entrepreneur to endeavor to do. So I would encourage that debt is used to ignite a flame, to expand a flame that's already lit, not to ignite the flame. So equity is a potential alternative for startup stage, but the reality is most investors are going to prefer to grant funding in exchange for equity when they're actually either in or after the proof of concept stage and really in growth stage. So there's a divergence here where the entrepreneur wants equity at proof of concept or initial concept, and investors want to give equity primarily for growth. So again, knowing this, am I going to encourage a startup business to go after equity funding? Probably not. It's a lot of time and energy. And in many cases, it's a waste of time and energy, but not in all. Really depends on the type of business. Some businesses have designed a highly leveraged, highly scalable business model that's of great interest to investors right now, or their real estate investors, and equity makes sense to that outside investor, and they don't mind being part of the initial stage. So it really depends on the business. But I would say 99% of small business owners are not designed to scale. They're not designed for leverage. They're highly service-oriented or product-oriented, mom and pop, if you will, and they're just not attractive to equity investors. And so a lot of people waste a lot of time building this equity pitch and really just need to focus on growing their business. Royalty is a very unique business funding model that is getting more playtime now. And royalty loans are really just capital that's repaid and tied directly to the company's top line, their revenue. And I actually happen to be a royalty lender and royalty borrower. It is my favorite of the 5 options source of revenue and a source of funding, because what royalty does that the others don't necessarily do is that there's no fixed cost associated with the repayment. I can predictably and reliably repay a royalty loan by using it by tying it to a percentage of revenue. There's lots of different royalty programs out there. They're generally royalty loans and not equity, and a very effective way to ease the stress and financial burden to the entrepreneur so they can focus on growth and not focus on trying to meet their debt service payments. Asset-based lending or asset-based funding is capital tied to a company asset, like franchising your business or co-ops or factoring or partnerships. And, when do you do this? It really just depends on the type of method that's used. So moving down a row here, the 5 C's you hear all the time, they're really designed for banks. So if you're going to get debt, so that's way up here at this level, for all these funding sources, the 5 C's are not as critical. So there are legitimate micro lenders, alternative lenders, CDFIs that are out there that are not traditional banks that don't care about the 5 C's or don't care about all of them. The key to debt financing is simply you have to be able to pay it back. You have to have the cash flow and the capacity to repay the loan. It's really that simple. And you have to demonstrate for yourself and others you have the integrity or the character to honor your agreements. The sources of lending, are down here. You can read those, but really, ultimately, if you're going to get a loan, you're not typically going to go after angel investors or venture capitalists. Yes, there is convertible debt, but that's not what they're in the game for. So you don't go in with that intention. So if you know that debt is your game, then you want to stick to these funding sources, and you need to really look at the different types of lenders. That makes sense. If you want to do factoring, then you're not going to go to your credit card company, right? So match the model with the source. So let me move on. So going back to this, when you've done this, you've figured out what the funding type is, you've figured out how much you want to raise, figured out what the funding method is, and then you've worked with professionals to define how you're going to use those funds so that you can actually fulfill on whatever it is you're promising to the funding source. So if you're saying that I'm going to pay you back in 5 years at this rate of interest, then your financial projections need to reflect that you actually have the capacity to do so. If you're going to generate equity fundraising, and you're going to use the money in a way, you have to demonstrate that the use of funds is going to generate the kind of growth and return that in 3 to 5 years you see a 10 times multiple on that investor's capital. So that all, this is why working with accountants and financial experts becomes critical, because if you can't tell that story effectively, then you're not even going to get through the door. And the reality is, perception is reality. So even if the entrepreneur themselves don't even fully understand all the pieces, and it's, there's not an investor on the planet that doesn't know that it's mostly made up and a bunch of assumptions, and there's a lot of risk involved. But, the perception is, if you've done your work and an entrepreneur is prepared and they're ready and they go in and can speak intelligently and in these terms, the opportunity and the likelihood of them getting funded is significantly higher. Again, do the first 15% right, you have a much higher chance of success. So defining investment terms, rewards, again, the terms are negotiable. So when you're doing things like royalty loans, or maybe you're putting some kind of creative business model together, or selling partnerships or co-ops or whatever, defining those terms and getting that clear, if you're doing any kind of crowdfunding, having a good reward defined is an important next step. And then the matrix. So now you've said, okay, this is my funding type, this is my method, this is how I'm going to use it. Now let me create a matrix so that I can focus my energy and my effort on this one category, and I'm not wasting time talking to everyone and anyone. And this is where, when there's good planning, the fundraising process can take 2 to 3 months. Not good planning, the fundraising process can take 6 months to a year or longer, or never get funded. So this is a sample comparison chart if someone chose to do crowdfunding. These are crowdfunding platforms. Well, if I were to choose crowdfunding, and I said I wanted to do debt funding, then I'm going to look at any crowdfunding platform that is focused on debt or has debt as one of their options. Now, if the funding platform only does equity, they don't make it to the chart. And then if you know anything about crowdfunding, there are different types of funding that are available, different ways that the platform deals with the vetting process before the loan is funded. And then there's different, let's assume that this is a real estate investment company. You want to focus on front platforms that focus and specialize on that niche. Now, whether you choose crowdfunding platform or private lending or private equity or whatever, you're going to choose the funding sources that are most aligned with the business model, with the niche, with the type of funding, the amount of funding, et cetera, that you're looking for. So anyway, so this is just an example of a chart that I would put together if I was going to start going after debt funding and I was a real estate investor. That way I could target my efforts and my energy and minimize the amount of time it takes. CDFIs, microlenders, and alternative lenders. So I mentioned this up in this chart above at this alternative lending site. CDFI is a community development financial institution. They're certified. They're certified at a local, a state, or a national level. And they specialize in providing non-traditional funding to underserved communities. They are tax-exempt charitable organizations, 501c3. They're primarily funded through government grants, foundations, and banks. And often CDFIs provide things like affordable housing. But what we're talking about is there are CDFIs out there that provide funding, loans, microloans, and small business loans to disadvantaged communities. So what makes you a disadvantaged community? You could be a woman-owned business that's considered to be a disadvantaged community. You could be a ethnically determined minority community like African American, Latino, etc. You could be in an economically disadvantaged geographic location. You could be in a zip code that the local or state, usually local government wants to spur economic growth, create jobs. So there are a lot of things that would make a business disadvantaged in the eyes of these funding sources. And these are highly legitimate sources. These lending sources, Accion is a national microlender. Generally, those loans, they're typically $25,000 and down. I think the smallest loan may be $5,000. And the thing I love about Accion, and I have been a borrower of Accion San Diego, what I love about Accion is the access to capital is the fastest I've seen. It takes about 7 to 10 days from start to finish. The 5 C's that we talked about don't really exist. I mean, somebody could have a foreclosure, could have a bankruptcy. As long as those derogatory credit issues are complete and they're not open and outstanding, that the foreclosure is done, the bankruptcy is done, they could be within the last year. As long as they're complete, you're still eligible to get a loan, which, you're not going to get traditional bank financing as an entrepreneur if you've got a bankruptcy or foreclosure in the last 3 to 5 to 7 years. So this opens up the access to capital, especially if people went through any type of economic downturn, any type of situation that they can explain. If the business can generate and demonstrate that there's cash flow to repay the loan, low credit scores isn't really an issue. Having collateral really is an issue. And access to Accion Capital really and other microlenders like them is extremely fast and easy. And that's something that entrepreneurs really need to know is that, can I really get a $10,000 loan in the next 7 to 10 days? Yes, you can. I've seen that the fees generally are about 1% upfront for processing and about averaging probably about 15% interest rate on the loans, and their typical loans, 3 to 5 years with principal and interest repayments. So the reality is this exists, and knowing which ones out there are legitimate is really, really good. But it is possible to get access to quick money. Well, what if you need 50,000? What if 25,000 isn't enough, or 250,000? Now you're talking about small business lending and working with more of a CDFI like VEDC. VEDC stands for Valley Economic Development Center. I actually, for full disclosure, sit on the board of directors for VEDC, which is a 501c3 charitable organization that's there to serve women-owned and minority-owned businesses nationwide through small business and microloans. And, I love supporting organizations that are really there to serve the entrepreneurial community, and I love what this organization has done for many, many, many entrepreneurs. Their interest rates are very competitive and very close to what traditional banks charge. So you're looking at getting bank rates 6 to 8% for a traditional loan, and you can get small business loans in the $250,000 range if you need to. There are more stringent requirements and higher level of due diligence you'd see there, more closer to a bank, but it's still a much easier process than a traditional bank. So bad credit and derogatories that or other variables that make you unbankable make VEDC and CDC, a small business, CDC is supported by the Small Business Administration. Both of these are really great small business funding sources, and they are nationwide. And there are others like them. I think a good place to look is who does the SBA support? SBA-backed lenders are held to a very different standard. And, you know, the cost of capital is much lower because the SBA backs and guarantees a lot of those loans, allowing those loan rates to be lower. So just know that there are a lot of, and again, the time for VEDC and CDC is probably closer to more traditional banking to get access to that capital. So you're looking at probably anywhere from 2 weeks to a month. Now, what happens a lot of times, and I'm kind of going a little bit off topic here, is that the biggest pain I think that entrepreneurs feel around funding is they want access to it immediately. It's speed and ease. And a lot of the, even CDFIs and CDCs haven't quite picked up on how to solve that pain that entrepreneurs face. And I am working very intentionally with VEDC specifically to get them to change their thinking and speed up the process, automate their due diligence process any way that they can so that they can give access to capital faster. Because what's happening is that there are a lot of companies out there right now, especially online lenders, that have solved that problem. So what they're doing is they're making it easy and they're making the speed to capital really fast. So you could get a loan within 24 to 48 hours or under a week in a lot of these online lending situations. So when you see that, buyer beware, because what's hidden in the fine print, and this is where accounting experts and financial professionals really can come in handy. Financial experts need to take the time to read the fine print for their clients. Need to be thinking about what is the true cost, what is the real terms of this, because there's not enough transparency in the marketplace right now to really show the consumer, the borrower, what they're getting. So you have what I consider to be predatory lenders out there, especially in the online lending space. Not all online lenders are predatory lenders. I can give one example right now of one online lender that is not a predatory lender. And that lender is DealStruck. They're actually a crowdfunding platform or an online lending platform that's highly funded. I think they just raised another $40 million or something like that. And they're eager to give small business loans and business lines of credit to small businesses nationwide. Their rates are in the low teens, I believe, and their turnaround, I believe, is anywhere from 7 days to 10 days. So they've created so much technology efficiency in their process and their due diligence process so sophisticated that they are able to speed up the process and make the whole due diligence process much better and easier. However, how does an entrepreneur tell the difference between a DealStruck and an OnDeck, for example? And I am going to call these guys out on the carpet for a minute here. Why do I call OnDeck out? Well, I'm calling them out because Intuit, one of our biggest product partners, providing what I think is one of the best accounting tools in the market for entrepreneurs, which is QuickBooks, has partnered with this online lender. And I was deeply disappointed. And the reason why is I don't feel that, from my interpretation of how OnDeck does its work, I don't feel like they're being as transparent as they could be about how this company actually works. You'll notice here, what are they doing? The application is 10 minutes, speed. If approved, your funding is in 24 hours, speed. Now, let me just bring something to the surface. What do everyday ordinary people who need money today, where do they go? They go to the check cashing store in the neighborhood. You can always tell the economic status or standards or the economic state of a community by how many check cashing stores there are in that community. On Deck, in my opinion, is a sophisticated, sleek version of a check cashing store. What is the main pitfall of a check cashing store? Well, you don't really get the terms. The terms aren't clear. What they sell is the speed to capital, and they design the repayment terms in language that talks about the payment amount but doesn't talk about the actual true cost of capital. Anytime you're paying something back daily or weekly, you're going to generate a massive cash flow constraint. There's virtually no entrepreneur on the planet that can sustain a daily or weekly payback. That's unsustainable. And quite honestly, if we really look at the cost of capital, and I haven't done a huge amount of due diligence here, but if you look at that cost of capital, when you have a daily payback system and the impact to the entrepreneur, what ends up happening is these entrepreneurs need the money fast. They just get the quick cash, and they don't think about the impact to their business and their cash flow and their ability to repay that loan. Also, what happens is there are companies like On Deck are being sued by banks and CDFIs and alternative lenders because they are getting paid back before lenders that have a first position. And so they are not playing nice with the other players. And quite honestly, I just don't feel like this is the type of loan that is really designed to serve entrepreneurs. If a company needs immediate cash, there are other ways to do so. But the reality is, what is going on that a company needs cash in 24 hours? What is going on with that business? Again, you cannot solve a money problem with money. You can only solve a money problem with ideas. There are instances, obviously it exists for a reason, but buyer beware. Know what you're getting. Don't think for an instant that this isn't something that could potentially cost you an entrepreneur 30%, 80%. So just pay attention to what's going on. Crowdfunding, I said I would mention briefly. I do have a whole webinar on crowdfunding. That's, I believe, 90 minutes that goes into greater detail about it. So if anyone is interested in learning more about crowdfunding, I go into much more detail. But just to touch the surface, crowdfunding is displacing venture capital, angel investment, and some traditional banking funding, which I mentioned very early on. The amount of crowdfunding money that was raised in 2012 was $3 billion. And there's a ton of growth happening here. And just in 1 year, it was looking to almost double. And now in 2015, I don't know what the current stat is, but this is a fast growing industry. Crowdfunding, the best way to think about it is it's a way to actually democratize access to capital. So what happened, crowdfunding's been around forever and ever and ever. What happened was people just got sick and tired of not being able to get access to capital. Banks were saying no. VCs and angels their criteria just didn't match. Like I said, 80 to 90% of most entrepreneurs just don't have a business model that is aligned for traditional debt funding, VC or angel money. So where do they go? So, this became a way for the crowd, the everyday ordinary people to participate in being able to say, hey, I believe in your business. I love what you're doing. I'm going to loan you $25. That's what crowdfunding is doing. It's saying, hey, I've got an extra $2,500. I want to make 10%, 15%, 20% of my money. I'm getting 1% in the money market. So let me try to put my money to use. And I'm going to diversify my $2,500 into $125 loans to 100 different businesses. That's the idea of crowdfunding. You're getting 2 or more people over the internet to pool their resources for a common service, product, project, cause, experience, and it is an international phenomenon, and it is growing quickly. Now, when people think of crowdfunding, most of them only think of Indiegogo or Kickstarter. And the reality is crowdfunding is a very big, broad term that's used in a lot of different types of funding. So the most common are reward and donation. Reward and donation reward crowdfunding is kind of like, it's most commonly used for artists. So if I'm going to create a new CD, I'm going to basically pre-sell or, give you some kind of reward in exchange for your funding. So I'm going to give you a t-shirt, or you're going to get my CD, or I'm going to give you credit on my song. I'm going to give you credit on my website. I'm going to put you in my next video or my next movie, and I'll give you credits or whatever in exchange for a non-monetary return in exchange for a monetary reward. That money is not repaid. It's just, hey, I'm going to give you some non-monetary reward in exchange for your capital. And really, what are people doing it? Because they believe in what that person's doing. They want to support their project. They want to support it. So really, it's mostly projects, not necessarily businesses, but some businesses do it as well. Donation is very obvious. If you're a 501c3 charitable organization, or you're a social venture, social enterprise, you can be a for-profit enterprise, you can get just a pure donation. People are giving you money because they believe in what you do. There's a lot going around with social causes like supporting veterans and supporting women, and you name it. It's philanthropy. Kiva is one of the biggest. They do a lot of third world country, international micro lending and donations all over the world. And it's really, for people looking to have control over where their donation dollars go, this is a good way to be on both sides of the fence. Hybrids do a mix of methods. Then you got equity, equity, lending, like Dale Struck, like I mentioned, and revenue sharing, which is what I talked about before. There's all kinds of other ones. But just know that reward and donation crowdfunding are not the only types. There are actually platforms out there that provide equity funding, lending, rev share, royalties, all kinds of stuff. Just to give you a sense, 62% of all the campaigns that were successful in 2012 were donation, then followed lending, which had 22%. And there's a lot of change and shift going on. The real estate investment, debt and equity funding platforms are probably one of the fastest growing of all. And there's a lot that happens that makes somebody crowdfunding viable. So again, there is a crowdfunding webinar. These are this is the main outline for that webinar. So if that's something that you or someone you know is interested, then let us know and we'll get that free webinar out to you. The other thing I want to point out, and this is specifically one of the crowdfunding sites, a lot of people think crowdfunding platforms are easy, quick, that there's not a lot of due diligence, not a lot of vetting or curation that happens. The reality is most of them curate. Most of them go through the same vetting process as a traditional lender, not all. And so you can expect to go through, only about 5% of any deal that's submitted is passed. So when I said at the very beginning, where are you going to spend your time, your valuable, precious time? Well, look to see if there's only a 5% chance. Don't start this process unless you're prepared. And be very targeted in where you're going to get your funding source, whether you're doing crowdfunding or any other type of funding source. Be prepared, because this is not an uncommon outcome to any type of funding. And there's a lot of elements that go into it. That's why you have a professional expert team. There's legal questions, there's finance issues, management issues, marketing questions, and then just managing the entire project. So I already talked about buyer beware, so I kind of put that a little bit out of order. And the key that I'll leave everyone with is, again, I've emphasized this a few times, working with most entrepreneurs that I work with and talk to, they do not understand what they are buying. They don't read their contracts. They don't understand what the true cost of the capital is. They don't understand how the terms could negatively impact them. They don't understand what it means to give up equity or why that could be a good thing. And so working with experts, I love this quote, an expert is someone who has succeeded in making decisions and judgments simpler through knowing what to pay attention to and what to ignore. So experts just cut through all the crap and they just get to what's important. they bring transparency to what is hidden in the fine print. And so working with an expert financial team, and obviously I think CPA Moms um, has is designed and has structured itself to be a resource for entrepreneurs, and being kind of that hub and spoke model, uh, bringing clarity to the owner by pulling in the legal experts, the funding sources, the financial planners, wealth managers, and looking at everything from a holistic perspective, but being kind of that facilitator, that quarterback, not having all the answers, not knowing what the right funding source is, but being able to facilitate the conversation and look at the strategy from a very strategic financial perspective. And I love that, we're really that eHarmony of the accounting world. So here we are. We're at the end of this. Let me stop the recording. Oops.